Thanks for being here this evening and for this presentation on Forbidden Fruit, A Brief History of Print Censorship. And please make sure you understand it is about print censorship. This isn't about movies. This isn't about TV. This isn't about anything. This is about specifically print censorship, the history of it. Now, my interest in print censorship actually began back in grade 5. And that was when my teacher, Miss Mann, confiscated my comic book. And it was a copy. I had it in my desk, and I still remember it was Tales from the Crypt. Yeah. And she took that away from me, and she said, as she did, little gentlemen don't read this kind of thing. I wanted to know why little gentlemen weren't supposed to, but I had the good sense to censor myself at the time, because I know Miss Mann would have handled things in a very different way than the way we do in schools today. But it left me with the question, who should decide what we should or shouldn't read? And that question has never left me. And so in 2005, I'd been about 5 years working at the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library at that point. I was asked to mount an exhibition at the library, and I chose specifically literary censorship as my subject. And then a few years later, I was asked to write this book, which is Forbidden Fruit, Banned, Censored, and Challenged Books from Dante to Harry Potter. Well, pretty soon then, I was starting to get invited to give lectures on, should I shut that door? Pretty soon after this, I was being invited to give lectures on the subject like this one tonight, mostly addressed to people who, like me, thought that print censorship was really a thing of the past, or at least we hoped it was. Well, fast forward 20 years, and I honestly never believed that we would be in the position we are now, where literary censorship, print censorship, is once again gaining as much ground as it is in the West. I suppose I shouldn't really be surprised, because even back then, 20 odd years ago, although I had the statistics to prove that the actual banning of books was very, very low by then, I also knew that at that point, never in history had the challenges to the wide variety of books in our schools and libraries and bookstores been so high. Evidently, those seeds of censorship, they were already being planted, and that harvest, in some jurisdictions right now at least, is being reaped today. So tonight, we're going to take a look at the history of print censorship in the West from the late Middle Ages to today. But my focus, you'll notice as I go along, it's not so much on the morality of censorship, nor is it on the legality of censorship, so much as what history teaches us is the ultimate futility of censorship. So if you look at this image here you have a beautiful woodcut from Ovid's Metamorphoses. It was printed in Venice in 1517. And the image that you're looking at depicts the adultery of Venus and Mars, while Venus's husband, Vulcan, looks on. That is the earliest example that I can find from the Fisher Library collections of someone who has deliberately decided for us what we should or should not see. So this is way back, as I say, in 1517. But if you look at that, has that effort really succeeded? Because what it really does is it focuses your attention on what is lying beneath those pen strokes on the left. I think you can see the bed there with the figures. So that obviously it defeats the censor's purpose. And as we take a quick look at the past 500 years of print history, considering specific published works and examining the reasons why people have tried to stop us from looking at them, I'm hoping that you will come to agree with me that these efforts are not only futile, but they are also short-sighted. My interest in print censorship was strengthened while I was studying theology, but it was significantly renewed in the aftermath of 9/11, when it became apparent to me that even in our very liberal society, the censorship of words, or at least the attempt to censor words, was very much alive and well. Magazines and newspapers, you might recall, became increasingly anxious not to offend readers who were still reeling from the vicious attacks on our American neighbors. So authors and artists and radio and television personalities who may have attempted to contextualize that terrible violence of that day You may recall people like Susan Sontag, Andy Rooney, and Bill Maher come immediately to mind to me at any rate. They were roundly criticized at the time for expressing a dissenting opinion, both on air but in print, and then they were silenced. And they were often forced by their bosses to issue public retractions for what in the end amounted to reasoned thought. One might fairly wonder what our world might have looked like today had the works of critics like Walter Cronkite been more broadly disseminated at the end of 2001, rather than restricted to very, very few journals and newspapers that most people weren't reading. I believe that history demonstrates that the censorship of words is futile because it does not and it cannot eliminate the ideas behind them. I believe that the strength of our democratic society is ultimately founded on the free flow of ideas, even bad ones, followed by their discussion and their criticism. And so, using history as our guide, I'm going to show you that the fact that we still have interesting and important books in our schools and in our libraries and our bookstores and our homes is testimony to courage. Because invariably, the presence of these books and journals on our shelves today means that someone, often at great personal cost, sometimes with their lives, committed themselves to publishing, disseminating, and then protecting this material for us to read, analyze, argue about, and enjoy today. The evolution of print censorship provides us with an interesting reflection of the concerns and the taboos of any given place and time in history. I like to think of those concerns with regards to censorship as a kind of an inverted pyramid. So, for example, in the 16th century, censors were dealing with the really, really big picture. And they were aiming to control what? The discussion about God and how God operated in the universe. So you can think here of men like Martin Luther and John Calvin, who challenged the theological status quo of their period and were challenged or silenced, depending where you were, for it. In the 17th century, that concern narrows a little bit more, the focus does, and it deals with the authors who wrote on the relationship specifically between God and this world from the perspective of science. Science specifically that appeared to contradict the Bible. And so here you can think of men like Copernicus and Galileo. In the 18th century, that concern or focus once again narrows a little bit more to philosophers like David Hume and Voltaire, who were inquiring by this time into the ways in which not so much God is involved with us, but the ways in which humans relate to each other politically and socially. Then, the 19th century, the censor's attention narrowed even more specifically with regards to humans, but specifically with regards to realism in literature and also evolutionary theory. So here, obviously, you think of men like Victor Hugo. And in the 20th century, it was one specific aspect of the individual that consumed the majority of the censor's ink, and that is, of course, sex. Now, one last technical comment. You're going to hear me use these three terms, and it helps if you can keep them straight in your mind. Published works, or unpublished, depending on the circumstance, they can be banned, they can be censored, and they can be challenged. So banned means exactly what it says, that a published book is absolutely forbidden. You can't get access to it, you can't read it. Censored means that a certain book, publication, images, if they are altered in the book, can then be allowed into public circulation, usually using black ink, as we saw. And then third is challenge. And challenge refers to the effort by anyone to try to ban or censor a work that is already in print. So without any further ado, let's look at how we got to where we are today in a world where, when you think about it, the internet has actually changed everything. Now, without doubt, the absolutely most effective tool set for the censorship of books, the censorship campaign in the West, was undertaken by the Roman Catholic Church beginning in the 16th century, lasting until the 20th. Now, for Roman Catholicism, the new printing press that was invented around the year 1450, it was a double-edged sword. Because on the one hand, if you think about it, it helped the church get her message out much more effectively and efficiently than it ever had before. On the other hand, that same printing press now threatened her previously uncontested control of thought and belief, because anybody could probably print something and get it out. And so to protect the church's privileged position, in 1557, Pope Paul IV authorized the very first index of forbidden books, and various editions were issued until the very last one was published at the Vatican in 1948. Now, according to the church's law, if an author's name, and you can see this is one page of the index on the right-hand side, rather lovely frontispiece to the index on the left side of the apostles throwing books into a fire based on a passage from the Acts of the Apostles. According to the church's law, if an author's name appeared on that right-hand side in the pages, then no one would be allowed to read or possess those books without special permission of church authorities. And even if permission was obtained, it would only be granted for individual books and only in urgent cases and only for a specified amount of time. Now, the index of forbidden books remained in effect in the church until 1966. And over the years included on it were such noteworthy books as Machiavelli's The Prince, Boccaccio's Decameron, Voltaire's Candide, Diderot's Encyclopedia, Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and Marx's Communist Manifesto, to name just a few. In the very last edition that was issued, I should say, in 1948, there were a total of 4,126 books, and 255 of those books alone came from the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century. Now, as an example, let's take a little more of a closer look at Galileo and his relationship with the Roman Index. In 1633, Copernicus's theory of heliocentrism, which, as you know, states that the sun and not the earth is the center of the universe. Well, that theory was condemned by the church, creating not just the Catholic Church, also the Lutherans and other Protestant churches. So let's be careful here. And that specific condemnation by the Catholic Church created a breach between religion and the scientific community that has been rather long in mending. Copernicus's intellectual disciple, Galileo, whom you see here on the right, he, in 1632, published his book called The Dialogue. And in it, he confirms Copernicus's theory as fact. And for that, of course, he was imprisoned 2 years later on the charge of heresy, because his book did appear to contradict the cosmology that is laid out in the first chapter of Genesis. Now, Galileo's book was condemned in the very same year that it was published. He was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. Now, not bad house arrest. If you see where he was under arrest in Florence, it's pretty darn nice. But it was still house arrest. And he stayed in house arrest until he died in 1642. Galileo's name remained on the index of prohibited books until 1835, and he himself was not officially rehabilitated by the church until 1992 by Pope John Paul II. As a literary example, let's consider Victor Hugo, one of his books that is most famous to all of us, whether we read it or we saw the play, Les Miserables. Now, it earned its place on the Roman Index in 1864, and because it was caught up in the church's terror of the social upheavals that were sweeping Europe at that time, upheavals that, of course, would ultimately result in the loss of the Papal States. Now, by the middle of the 19th century, church censors, they had shifted their focus from theological and scientific and philosophical issues to questions of personal morality. Their concern, if you think about it, was this new realistic style of novel that was beginning to emerge in the 19th century, novels like Les Miserables. In these novels, and they were particularly French, the French seemed to be very good at producing these very realistic novels. There were depictions, of course, of sexual impropriety, depictions of atheism, moral relativism, the serious plight of the poor, of course, and a broad-based secular humanism that seemed rampant in their society, and specifically rampant in the writings of authors like Victor Hugo, Balzac, Stendhal. And so all of them almost all of the French authors ended up on the Roman index. Now, the church, we have to remember, was not the only institution that was resisting this French realism in novels. Public libraries in North America, especially in the United States, and national governments all around the world, they were banning the French books as well. But the church's index, the Catholic Church's index, was by far the most efficient at this task. Well, think about it. Why? Because they're like McDonald's. There is an office everywhere. And so it was very easy to be able to control print from this vantage. Victor Hugo, by the way, he was finally removed from the Roman index in 1959. Now, before we move on from the index as a form of literature, if you will, in itself, a brief word about another form of church censorship that the church itself developed, which eventually had much greater influence, especially with governments around the world, both democratic and non-democratic governments. And that's this book, the Index Librorum Expurgatorum. Now, it comes out again in the 16th century, but its purpose was specifically to help librarians in the partial censorship of works by otherwise acceptable authors. And they did that by issued an index, you would get it, and it would indicate in the index the edition of the book, the page number, count down how many lines, and then start blacking out everything for the next 10, 20 lines, whatever it is, using a black ink. Now, among such authors, again, was Copernicus, whose theory, as we said, about heliocentrism had been condemned by church authorities, both Catholic and Protestant. Well, this is a very common thing that you will find with the books of Copernicus. Very, very common, you'll find it, especially in Catholic countries. What happens is the librarian would get the directive from Rome of what to expunge, but most of them, what they did, because everybody thought, you know, Copernicus is actually right, but we have to do what we are told. And so if you probably, I don't know if you could tell from where you're sitting there, but really, that becomes a highlighter. You can still read the text. The line, all it's doing is indicating the parts of the book that you should be reading. And then to make matters worse, and this is the case all throughout Europe, where you find this. And again, not terribly uncommon. Someone, according to that hand, I would say within the next 50 years, 50 to 70 years, has just written the text back in the margin. So this is why I say I keep coming back to this idea that this is futile. This exercise is futile when it comes right down to it. Now here, you can see what I think is the most aesthetically beautiful instance of censorship that I have ever seen. And it comes from Erasmus's 1538 commentary on the works of St. Ambrose. Now you can see here that the librarian has gotten his Index Librorum Expurgatorum and has done exactly as he's been told. He's got the right page. He's counted down the number of lines. But this librarian obviously loves this book and does not want to see it scarred. And so he creates the most beautiful forms of censorship here with the blue and the red or orange, whatever color that is. And around it, if you could get in really close, you could see he's done these beautiful Baroque frames with cherubs holding it up and the whole thing. Now, you cannot read. He's done a good job. You cannot read the text of this one. It is blocked out. And the book is defaced. You can't say the book isn't defaced, but it's done in the most beautiful way that you could possibly imagine. This is one last example of another copy of Erasmus's Adages at the Fisher. This one hadn't been cataloged. I was cataloging it, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago now, and I came across this. Horrendous. This is a librarian that did not care about this book and just sort of, scribbled out the offending passage, but was obviously, and you could tell from the frontispiece that he had actually written something at the front saying there are parts of this that you should stay away from. And to make sure you stay away from it, this is me trying to get the pages open. He actually glued the pages together so that, and we have left the book glued so that you can see what they had done. And this is not the only page where this has happened. This happens in number of places in the book. At any rate, the whole point is to say that, to me, it's ironic that when authorities declare to us what we should not read, they actually leave a permanent legacy of what was truly important to that generation. The verdict of time, it generally mocks the judgment of the censors, and it invariably furthers admiration for targeted books. If you really want to make a novel popular, what do? You ban it. That's when people try to get their hands on it. It's worthy of note that there was never an equivalent, as I said, in the Protestant world to the Roman Index. And it's not that the Protestants liked these books any better. They didn't. I mean, you can read Protestants at the time saying, not in my church, not in my jurisdiction. The problem is because Protestantism was so fractured by the 16th century and into the 17th century, they didn't have the universal force to be able to accomplish what they wanted to do. One last anecdote, which I've always found amusing. Do you know the Bodleian Library at Oxford? It's the most wonderful library. If you ever get there, you have to see the Bodleian. Well, the very first librarian of the Bodleian, of course, was a Protestant. And so what he did annually, he obtained a copy both of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, and the Index of Expurgated Books. He did it not for the reason you think. What he did was he got both of those indexes. He would scan it really carefully, and from that, he would use it to determine what books he should add to the Bodleian. Now, as I say, in fairness to Roman Catholicism, we must remember the Catholic Church did not corner the market on censorship. Right now, you're looking at the title page on the left to what is one of the most important English books ever printed, the 1534 edition of Tyndale's New Testament. Now, England, as I hope you'll recall, was the very last European country to allow the Bible to be printed in the vernacular. And the reason for that prohibition was that Henry VIII and his ministers believed that the scriptures could not be correctly understood by the lower classes without the interpretation of their betters. And so, how do you make sure that happens? You leave it in Latin. Don't translate it. Well, Tyndale thought otherwise, and he vowed that he wasn't going to rest until the English scriptures found their way into the hands of the plowboy, the common plowboy. His New Testament, when it appeared, was condemned by Henry and the church in England. Tyndale himself was arrested in Antwerp, and then he was strangled and burned at the stake. Now, this is one of the things with digital imagery that is always a problem. You have this sense here that this book is enormous. It's not. It's the size of your wallet. And the whole purpose, he knew what was going to happen by publishing this book. And so he published it in a size that it could be hidden up a sleeve or hidden under a hat, just plain hidden. And so he understood the power of the censor in Tudor England, even beyond England into the Low Countries. Possession of that book on the left remained illegal in England even after the Reformation began. And if you had it, or you had a portion of it, you could face the death penalty for it, and people did. Now, sufficient numbers of copies of that particular book were hidden, and they survived, so that about 9/10 of Tyndale's New Testament lives on today in what we call the King James Version of the Bible. It has had a direct effect on the development of our language, unlike any other book. So the adage goes, no Tyndale, no Shakespeare. Now, that's Tyndale. On the right-hand side, more than 100 years after that, in 1683, after the British monarchy had been restored following the English Civil War, the University of Oxford now issued its own index of forbidden books, condemning, quote, pernicious books and damnable doctrines that were repugnant, as they said, to the scripture, the tradition of the Church of England, and the royal government. And so among the ideas that are condemned in this index, you can find this index at the Fisher Library, in that list are the thoughts of people like Thomas Hobbes is condemned, John Knox is condemned, John Milton is condemned. So again, before we get on our high horse, University of Oxford and Henry VIII were doing the same thing in England. So be careful. Now, the most famous modern crusade, I'm skipping centuries here because we don't have the time, but most famous modern crusade, of course, against literature was the 1933 Nazi bonfires of any books that were deemed to be subversive or written by Jewish authors. Now, under this rubric, such things were committed to the flames as the musical scores of Mendelssohn, books by Einstein and Freud, among many others, committed to the flames in their thousands. On the bottom right, if you get to Berlin, you should see this. This is a new monument that has been erected in the floor, in the ground of the square where the burning of the books took place. It was created by Micha Ullmann, and it is set in that, say, the ground of the Bibelplatz. where the burnings occurred on the 10th of May, 1933. And what you're looking at, if you look down, is a room with empty bookshelves. It's a very stark reminder of what censorship has done throughout our history. Now, I'm not saying that printing presses haven't helped propagate bad ideas, many of them loathsome, such as Hitler's Mein Kampf, for example, because they have, and they still do. But generally speaking, history shows that it is the stronger members of society who use censorship as a tool to keep the weaker members of society, quote, in their place. In the pursuit of control, societal control, it has been much easier in the past for authorities simply to ban a book than to discuss it, or a journal, or whatever, even a controversial book or journal. So this might be as good a time as any to review, however briefly, the Canadian record. Since well before 1867, various Canadian legislatures have enacted laws aimed at controlling vice and combating sedition. Now, for the most part, this was accomplished by Canada Customs. And the reason for that is because when you think about it, until recently, most of the very most popular books that are read and were read in this country were published abroad. And so it was Canada Customs until 1968 who really controlled our reading habits. And until 1968, customs officials, they were given a handy list of forbidden publications when refusing to admit a book or a journal into the country at the border. Now, no such guide exists any longer. So in this, between 1968 and effectively 2000, what was happening was border guards were told to use their discretion. And that meant there were a lot of problems. And you can see how they come up here in these old newspaper clippings. The customs agents didn't even have to have read the book to prevent it from coming into the country. They just had to they could get a sense from the title. They could hear from someone else that, oh, this book, it talks about this, so probably we shouldn't allow it in. And so that's what was happening. Books were getting stopped at the border. In particular, it seemed to be in large part, it was especially books from the LGBTQ community that were being blocked. And the odd thing about it was they were being blocked if they were going to LGBTQ bookstores. They weren't being blocked if they were going to Kohl's. So there's an economic thing in all this as well, but that's another story. Well, in the year 2000, the Supreme Court, while it upheld the right of customs agents to continue to inspect and seize offensive materials, it also criticized the agency for the focus that they had put on books and where they were going. And they also determined that customs agents from that point on could only confiscate material that had been specifically ruled by the courts to constitute an offense under the Criminal Code of Canada. So a much, much better system than we had. Now, subsequent legislation since then, especially the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2015, has caused Canadian civil liberties groups to become ever more vigilant these days, as government and society are still trying to maintain that delicate balance necessary between preserving community norms, preserving national security, and preserving freedom of expression. Now, that's all well and good if you're talking about imported books, but Canada Customs has absolutely no jurisdiction over materials that are printed inside the country. And as a result, it has been possible in the past to produce a book in Canada legally that it would be otherwise illegal to import. And this is a good example of it. It was illegal as of 1918 to import any copies of the Communist Manifesto. So how did Canadians get around it? Well, a private person in Vancouver decided he would publish it himself, which he did, and nobody could do anything about it because it wasn't in violation of the stated criminal code at this point. 1919, he publishes this, and it's a beautiful little pamphlet. But what I love about it was that he is responding to the disillusionment that Canadian soldiers felt upon their return from the First World War, only to find that they didn't have jobs, that there weren't social supports for them, that all sorts of things were being denied them, that they felt, I fought for these things. And so, quite brilliantly, he puts this beautiful poppy on the front cover, and it speaks volumes in itself. So, and the fact is that in Canada, it is the criminal code that hypothetically deals with print censorship. But that's problematic as well, because the code depends on, in the way it's written, what are vaguely described as community standards to determine what is a threat or what is offensive, but it doesn't define which community or whose standards. So this is still a problem when it comes to dealing with printed materials in Canada. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in the last 100 years, obscenity has become the bugbear of Canadian censorship. And so in 1954, just to make things a little clearer, the government formally defined obscenity in the criminal code to state that obscenity is any publication, a dominant characteristic of which is the undue exploitation of sex or of sex and any one or more of the following subjects, namely crime, horror, cruelty, and violence. These shall be deemed to be obscene. But if you think about that definition, it begs several questions. First of all, does the definition of obscenity remain valid forever? Is what was obscene in the 19th century obscene in the 21st? And also, I love the statement of if it is an undue exploitation of sex. So does that mean there is a due exploitation of sex? It's a very odd phraseology. Should interpretation of what is obscene remain in the hands of individuals who may not have even read the offending item? Because that's still possible. You can proof text it. You don't have to read the whole thing to try and ban a book. So to this day, the few independent bookstore owners who are still around, they continue to lock horns with the enforcers of this imprecise law. And while it is true that until recently, the actual banning of books had become a rarity, as I mentioned earlier, there have never been so many challenges made to individual publications in our history as there have been over the last 70 years. Let's consider just a few examples from Canada's censorship history. James Joyce's He published Ulysses in 1922. Now, if any of you have ever tried to read it, good luck. It is the most unreadable book that has ever been written. If you made it through to the end, good for you. I've never met anyone who made it through the end. The problem with the book is that it has graphic biological descriptions all through it. And the book was banned in Canada in 1923. And that ban was not lifted until 1949. Now, the fact is, it was actually banned in the United States a few months before it was banned here. So you could read it here, but not in the United States for a while. One of my favorite stories about this, Ernest Hemingway, as you probably realized, was a reporter for the Toronto Star at one point. He had gone back to the States by this point, but he still had friends here in Toronto. So what he did was one day, he and his friends sailed out from the New York side across to the middle of Lake Ontario, where he met up with some Canadian pirates who passed contraband boxes of Ulysses from boat to boat as though they were a prohibited gin shipment. And that was how copies of the forbidden book made their way into the United States. Even after the ban against Ulysses was lifted in Canada 27 years later, you still had a number of libraries across Canada to make a formal application. And on some of them, you had to state that you were mentally fit to be able to read it.
Oh, well.
Now, another book that some of you may have had copies of this, when the unexpurgated edition of D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover finally appeared in Canada in 1960. Remember, it was printed in the 1920s, but the version of it that made its way to Canada was a very, very heavily edited version. When the unexpurgated one came in 1960, it was immediately banned. Judge Fontaine, T.A. Fontaine in Montreal, he pronounced the book to be obscene. And in the process, he set aside the expert testimony of authors Hugh MacLennan and Morley Callahan, who said this is not obscene. But the judge declared that their interventions were, quote, purely personal opinion, as though his was not. And as it turned out, he hadn't read the book. He proof texted it. In 1962, the Supreme Court of Canada, it ruled that Lady Chatterley was not obscene and allowed it to be sold. But 2 years later again, it was condemned in Ontario once more. And finally, it had to go back to the Supreme Court again, and it was only narrowly dismissed by the Supreme Court of Canada in a 5-4 decision. There is no question that print censorship and other forms of censorship as well are now enjoying a renaissance in our Western society. But the fight has largely shifted ground to the classroom and to the public library. So here's a little list that brings us up to today. In 1998, Francesco Leo, you can see there at the top middle, Francesco Leo Bloch's novel Baby Bebop was removed from public school libraries in Calgary after complaints that there was gay and lesbian content in it. In 2006, school boards in Toronto, York Region, Greater Essex, and Ottawa limited access to Deborah Ellis's wonderful book, 3 Wishes, in elementary schools after complaints from the Canadian Jewish Congress about its portrayal of the ongoing Mideast conflict. In the very same year, the Dufferin Peel Roman Catholic School Board banned Snow Falling on Cedars, again, a beautiful book, if you ever haven't read it. It banned the book from all of its classrooms in response to an anonymous complaint about sexual content in the book. And this is a book that is used in high schools. And I love this. The board at the time said, the book isn't being banned, it just isn't being made accessible. Yeah. How Orwellian is that description? Very courageously, however, the following year, the board actually struck a committee. The book was read by everyone on the committee, and it was reinstated, though not without some controversy. One of my absolute favorites, however, was a challenge that was issued in 2014 against the Toronto Public Library, which was asked to ban this book, Dr. Seuss's Hop on Pop, because one gentleman felt it was too violent. The complainant actually demanded that the book be removed from the public library's collections and that the TPL, quote, issue an apology to fathers in the GTA and pay for damages resulting from the book. Obviously, it didn't happen. And I'm not even going to delve into the Harry Potter series upon which the American Library Association has bestowed the dubious distinction of the most frequently challenged book in the 21st century. Until recently, one of the most insidious practices currently involving school systems is a passive but equally detrimental form of censorship. Many years ago, in the last century, I was teaching high school English at the Etobicoke School of the Arts, and I personally witnessed 2 principals, wonderful principals, as you know, wonderful principals, and English department heads drop books from that year's curriculum that they knew were good and they admitted were good. But as they explained at our first meeting of the year, they thought they might be too controversial. They didn't want to deal with the parents. So without fanfare, discussion, or publicity, excellent books disappeared from the curriculum. No one was held accountable for their decisions to eliminate works ranging from The Merchant of Venice to Like Water for Chocolate. Just to give you one example of how ludicrous this can all be. W.O. Mitchell's classic work, one of my favorite books of all time, is the work of Canlit, Who's Seen the Wind. If you have never read it, you've got to read it. I studied it in grade 9, but the book seems to have simply disappeared from the classroom today, and it's not because it's bad literature. The principal objection has been that one of the characters in the book, who is an old prairie farmer, uses the expletive goddamn when he speaks quite regularly. So beginning in 1975, and it started out in British Columbia, parents demanded that the Minister of Education remove the book because it taught their 15-year-olds, quote, how to swear in front of the class. One English teacher, however, and you have to understand these books go on trial. There's an actual trial. So one teacher testifying at this book's trial, she said that she doubted that students really needed Mitchell to instruct her kids on how to curse. Didn't make any difference. The book has disappeared for the most part. And similar stories can be told of Morley Callahan's Such Is My Beloved, Margaret Lawrence's The Diviners, Alice Munro's Lives of Girls and Women, and the list goes on and on. Some high school English departments have simply let these books slide so that they don't have to deal with them and the trouble that they associate in the year ahead. Now, things have certainly taken a strange, unexpected twist in the latter part of the 20th and early 21st centuries. It seems as though everybody has become so sensitive about everything that it's almost impossible to publish anything without offending someone. And I refer here to that new kind of censorship, which is often called political correctness. Now, it may be practiced by people on the political left, but it has the same detrimental effect as does censorship advocated by the political right. Only yesterday, if you were looking at the New York Times by any chance, Margaret Atwood observed that it was this form of left-wing censorship that began in the 1970s that has opened the floodgates for the right to do the very same thing today. But we have to admit, they're being much more effective in it. One of the characteristics of political correctness is that it often tries to deny historical reality in favor of unhistorical idealism. So, for example, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice is challenged in English classrooms because of its realistic depiction of anti-Semitism. A Comedy of Errors has been similarly challenged for its supposed misrepresentation of transvestitism. Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, Uncle Tom's Cabin, banished from the classroom for showing what life in the old American South was really like, complete with its prejudices and its offensive language. But the point is that eliminating these texts that do depict racism or homophobia or misogyny, it doesn't get rid of the racism or the homophobia or the misogynism. But what it does get rid of is the opportunity to discuss those realities with students in a controlled academic setting where much can be learned to combat those sad realities. Perhaps the most famous work to be banned in modern times for political correctness was this one, Salman Rushdie's novel, The Satanic Verses, which earned him all sorts of awards, but also a death sentence under the late Ayatollah Khomeini. Objections were raised by the international Islamic community, and they caused the book to be banned in South Africa. It was burned in Britain, and it was prohibited in most Muslim nations. But Canada earned the distinction of being the sole Western democracy that actually seized the book as hate literature. Ironically, they did it during Freedom to Read Week. You may recall that Rushdie, as you see here, he was stabbed in the eye in 2022 by someone who was trying to fulfill that fatwa, the fatwa that still remains in effect. As a footnote, until very recently, you could find no copy of this book on the open stacks at Robarts Library all the time I was there. I found today one copy is on the shelves because it routinely was stolen or damaged. And the first edition of that is housed in the Fisher Library to make sure that it cannot be vandalized. Sadly, today we can add more books to this catalog of banned, censored, and challenged publications, both in this country and especially in certain places in the United States. This past summer, the government of Alberta attempted to ban from its schools all books that had sexual content in grades 1 through 9. Well, think about that. That means no sex education. By doing this, Alberta has joined a culture war about books and book banning that really has its roots not here, but in the more right-wing American jurisdictions such as Florida, where only publications, quote, free of bias and indoctrination when discussing race, cultural diversity, or socioeconomic issues are allowed. That means that in Florida and in other American jurisdictions now, books about slavery, about the American war record in Vietnam, about the historic maltreatment of Indigenous people have been removed from state public schools, along with age-appropriate publications about human sexuality. And so in Florida now, anyone helping a student gain access to books deemed inappropriate by those enforcing the government's restrictions are subject to a third-degree felony charge. That means librarians and teachers can be charged as felons. This seems to be the model that Alberta had wanted to follow, and the government's focus largely on books dealing with human sexuality, but not just that. Here you have a list of a partial list that you can see of the books that the Edmonton Public School Board was saying, okay, well, if we're going to follow legislation, these are the ones that we're going to have to ban. Now, interestingly, mostly have sexual content to them. The legislation provides an exemption in Alberta. What is that exemption? For biblical texts, which means that you could read in school about Lot's sexual relations with his daughters in the book of Genesis, or David's rape of Bathsheba, because that wouldn't come under the rubric that they are attempting to pass. Two lobby groups in the province, Action for Canada, a right-wing, which is a right-wing Christian organization, and Parents for Choice in Education, which routinely challenges anything to do with the lesbian and gay community in Alberta, they were very quick to take credit for the province's actions. And not surprisingly, the legislation was opposed by the Alberta Teachers Association, the library boards, all that kind of stuff. And you know, if we were able to look through that book, you would find that list. You would find that on it are such books as The Godfather, Jaws, The Color Purple, Brave New World, I Know Why the Caged Birds Sing, and The Great Gatsby, no longer to be taught in Alberta schools. Well, not surprising, people got upset about it, and among the people that got upset about it was Margaret Atwood. And you don't want to get Margaret Atwood against you. And so she put out this tweet, and I don't know if you saw it, but it's a brilliant tweet. She says, well, here's a piece of literature by me suitable for 17-year-olds in Alberta schools, unlike, we are told, The Handmaid's Tale, because it's on the list to be banned. She says, sorry, kids, your Minister of Education thinks you are stupid babies. So here's the story. John and Mary were both very, very good children. They never picked their noses or had bowel movements or zits. They grew up and married each other and produced 5 perfect children without ever having sex. Although they claimed to be Christian, they paid no attention to what Jesus actually said about the poor and the Good Samaritan and forgiving your enemies and such. Instead, they practiced selfish, rapacious capitalism because they worshipped Ayn Rand. And it goes on and on and on. But I mean, the whole... what she effectively did was she embarrassed the government of Alberta so badly that this is exactly what we all knew was going to happen. Alberta had to back off and say, you know, we got to rethink this legislation. The fact of the matter is, and history proves this over and over and over again, making print disappear doesn't resolve anything. The realities of sexuality, the prejudices of human beings, the challenges of history that books and magazines record, they don't go away just because you banned a book. The fact is, you actually make the publication far more popular. But more importantly, I would argue that it is more important than ever that our students today, especially if have access to such materials in their age appropriateness, in their classrooms and in their libraries. Why? Because in the classroom and the library setting, students can engage with one another and their teachers in a meaningful way that will help them understand complicated things and grow together into maturity. Those who are trying to ban and censor such publications, when you think about it, they're really trying to force their kids to live in a world that passed away 30 years ago. They are forgetting that even if they should succeed in banning printed materials, their kids will still have access to the internet, where they're being exposed daily to images and ideas that are unfiltered, whether they like it or not. But reading literature or history and science in a classroom with a professional who has been trained for this job, or in the company of a teacher librarian who understands what it means to select books and what it is to be age appropriate, by working with them, our young people are aided in the process of becoming adults. We are navigating them through that difficult process. And like it or not, the internet is now forcing all of us to have actual conversations about what is appropriate for reading and viewing and what is not. Conversations that we should have been having generations ago, but in the past we just simply issued a ban. In the end, no one has ever said, I think this book or magazine should be banned or censored because it will have a negative effect on me. Books and journals and magazines are always challenged by those who think that they know better than their neighbors and are supposedly protecting their best interests. But at its core, censorship is paternalistic. It's based on the exercise of authority rather than on reasoned argument. And I truly believe, as I was taught in school, the argument from authority is always the weakest. It presumes either that I can't handle controversial material myself, or that I can't teach my children how to read it. As I've tried to indicate this evening, it's generally a futile exercise anyway, and one that is going to become even more futile as the internet makes censorship almost impossible. Choosing what to read often does involve a moral choice, but it is precisely our moral choice, not someone else's. It should involve thought and discussion within the community, but that process should not be short-circuited by the simple flexing of the authority of government, even if it is being exercised on my behalf. Like it or not, in a democracy, writers and journalists have every right, sometimes even the obligation, to offend. And I have every right to be offended. But as history shows, in a free society, it is that very push and pull which in the end strengthens us and pushes civilization forward, sometimes quite painfully. Lastly, I'd like you to ask this question yourself. What would my world look like today if the censors had actually succeeded? And the books that I have mentioned and the countless others in our libraries and classrooms and bookstores and newsagents had actually been destroyed or never published at all. Your answer, I hope, would be the same as that of George Bernard Shaw, who said, censorship ends in logical completeness when nobody is allowed to read any books except the books that nobody reads.